Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Called to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks. I'm your host, Douglas Guilfoyle, Professor of International Law and Security at the University of New South Wales, Canberra. Today we are continuing our series on classic cases, the What Does Everyone Get Wrong About Classic Case X series. And today we're looking at the overquoted, under-authoritative and deeply de-historicized Caroline case, and in particular, what everyone gets wrong about its implications for the law of self-defense. And here to walk us through it is our regular co-host, Associate Professor Imogen Saunders, Director of the Centre for International and Public Law at the Australian National University College of Law. Or are you now the ANU Law School? It's hard to keep up.
We are the ANU Law School at the Australian National University College of Law, Governance and Policy.
Law, governance and policy. Right, yes, as I understand it, in that reshuffle, you guys gained jurisdiction over epidemiology as well, much, I'm sure, to the concern of medics everywhere. In any event, before we begin, I remind everyone that in these informal conversations, we are, as always, speaking off the cuff and without benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. And before we get down to business, traditional first question. Imogen, what's your drink?
I am having a coffee because we are recording in the morning. It's not a fancy coffee, it's just a filter coffee, but it is very hot and it is made with freshly ground beans, so it is smelling delicious.
That's wonderful. I'm having a large and slightly weak mug of tea as I attempt to power through Thursday. All right, so we're continuing our series of rants, as we've said, about, what cases do or don't say about international law and how everyone gets a particular version of them that we've received wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And today we're discussing the so-called Caroline case. So Imogen, opening question, why is it so called and what was it actually about?
Well, I will answer those questions, Doug, but before we get into them, I just want to go on a little deviation at the very beginning, because I did do a bit of research for this episode. And in doing so, I just was reminded of how much international lawyers love a pun when they are writing journal articles. And
Try working in the law of the sea, Imogen.
Well, that is where we are going, because the Caroline case, so-called, is about a boat that sunk, which I'll go into. And so just think about how many puns you could have about sinking boats. And I found 5 journal articles with a different one, which I will tell you in an order that I think makes sense in terms of the story. So there is a journal article called Docking the Caroline. There is a journal article called Destroying the Caroline. Then we get to Sinking the Caroline, Raising the Caroline, and finally Salvaging the Caroline.
Nice.
So if we were to ever write on this, we'd have to think of another nautical pun to do with a ship sinking that hasn't already been done to the poor old Caroline to write about it.
Excellent. But first bugbear, is it a case?
First bugbear, yes. Okay, so my first bugbear is the Caroline case is not a case, and it gets referred to as that. Now, strictly linguistically speaking, it could be a case in the sense that case means a situation or a set of affairs. But in a legal sense, when we talk about a case and we mean a court case where something has reached adjudication, the Caroline is not that.
Right.
But it gets referred to as that, which just rubs me up the wrong way. So let's talk about what it actually is. The facts of it, it's a set of facts that happened in 1837 in the context of the Canadian Rebellion. Canada was still a British colony at that point, the British North American colonies. A group of Canadian/British North American militia crossed the Niagara River from the Canadian side to the American side, where the steamship Caroline was docked. They unmoored the steamship Caroline, they set it on fire, and the strong currents of the Niagara River then took it over the Niagara Falls, whereupon it was dashed to pieces at the bottom.
Right, that's a pretty dramatic set of imagery, right?
Very dramatic.
You make a cross-border raid, you set a steamship on fire, and then allow the steamship on fire to go over the Niagara Falls.
Exactly. And
sounds like they really, really, really wanted to destroy the Caroline.
They weren't a fan of the Caroline, and I'll get to the reasons why a bit later. But then there was, at the time, there was some question about how many, if any, people were killed in this incident. It seems that probably at least 2 were, but reports were up to 11. But then it seems actually those people got off and were on the shore and fine by the time the ship actually got destroyed.
But shades of the Rainbow Warrior.
Exactly.
For whatever reason the vessel was destroyed, there was not sufficient care taken to make sure no one was on board at the time.
Well, yeah, indeed. I'm pretty sure the militia didn't really mind who was on board. But this was just a sort of a border event in a series of border events that had been ongoing. And there wasn't much fuss. I mean, there was some fuss and, as you say, very dramatic imagery. There was some cartoons, like political cartoons at the time about it. But nothing really happened diplomatically until a few years later when a Scottish-Canadian man called Alexander MacLeod was arrested in New York and charged with murder for the 2 people who died. That then caused a diplomatic incident, and both Canada and the UK demanded his release. In the end, he actually got acquitted because he had an alibi, but it became a note of diplomatic correspondence. And there were 2 people at the time who were corresponding. One was called Daniel Webster, who was a US congressman, and one was called Lord Ashburton, who was a British politician. And they were corresponding about a series of events about these border issues between the US and the British North American colonies. And the Carolyn just became one of the things that they were corresponding about. They actually ended up drawing up this thing called the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which settled a number of disputes among the US and British North American colony borders. But the reason the Carolyn became famous and this oft-quoted thing is a sentence that Daniel Webster first wrote and that Lord Ashburton agreed with about whether the destroying of it would be justified. And Webster wrote that for the act to be justified, it will be for the government to show a necessity of self-defense, instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. And that is the doctrine, as it were.
Famous Caroline formula.
Exactly.
So why was there a claim of self-defense in the mix at all? I understand there are a series of cross-border incidents, but why is the Caroline itself implicated as some object against which defensive action needed to be taken?
Yes, that's a really good question, Douglas. And it sort of brings me to my second point, is the Carolyn is not only misquoted because it's not a case, but it's misquoted because what it's used for, as you'll know, that famous doctrine is used for anticipatory self-defense. And it's said to be the formula for anticipatory self-defense. And so before I get to your very good question, I just want to go through as a quick sidebar for those who might not be as familiar with the different forms of self-defense. Traditional self-defense is where, like in individual criminal law, where you're under an attack and you can defend against that attack. So just as it applies to people in criminal law domestically, it applies to states internationally. If a state is under attack, they can respond to that attack. And it's one of the exceptions to the general prohibition on the use of force. Anticipatory self-defense, however, is the idea that the attack hasn't happened yet, but it is imminent. And the doctrine of anticipatory self-defense in international law posits that when an attack is imminent, a state doesn't have to sit around and wait for it to happen. They can actually defend themselves against it before it happens. And now, this has all sorts of problems, as you know well, and perhaps we can chat about what exactly does imminent mean, how far in advance can you defend yourself. But the reason that it's problematic in the Carolyn sense is that any claim of self-defense against the Carolyn was not anticipatory. Because this gets back to why were the militia so eager to set the Carolyn on fire? What had this ship done? So as I said, the ship was set on fire, and it was set on fire on the evening of the 29th of December, 1837. But there is a longer history to that. So the short history is evening of the 29th of December, 1837, a group of Canadian militia crossed the Niagara River from Canada to the US to the steamship Carolyn. They unmoored it, they set it on fire, whereupon currents took it over the Niagara Falls. The longer history is about 2 weeks earlier, on the 13th of December, a group of armed militia who were mostly US citizens invaded and took possession of Navy Island, which was part of Canada, part of the British North American colonies. So this is an act of territorial incursion. It's an armed attack. On the 29th of December, the Caroline left the US port of Buffalo. It sailed up the river and it made 3 stops at Navy Island, going back and forth across the river, dropping off more militia, dropping off its assumed weapons, and generally carrying out a supplies run, adding to the invading force, as it were. So because of that, the Canadian militia decided that they couldn't have this ship continually resupplying the US troops who were in possession of Canadian land, and they sunk the ship. Now, the reason why this, I think, is problematic is that's not anticipatory self-defense.
No. Like if there's an ongoing armed conflict because there's an occupation of your territory, then even if it's ostensibly a civilian ship, but it's being used for a military purpose, then, sort of dual use infrastructure, law of targeting, it becomes a target in the ordinary course of hostilities, I would have presumed.
Exactly. And that's exactly how it was actually viewed at the time. So I've got a quote from Lord Ashburton, who says, and he's trying to convince Daniel Webster at this point that the sinking was justified. It's because part of the issue was that, the Canada had crossed to the US side. So the US is saying, well, you've, come across to our territory, and Canada's saying, well, Canada and Britain behind it is saying, well, you came to ours first, you're supplying weapons, we just did what we had to do to stop the militia doing that. Not the US, I should make this clear actually, because it's important. So it wasn't the US acting, they were US citizens, they weren't funded or supported by the government in any way. They were private actors who were coming to support the Canadian rebels. But in terms of whether it was anticipatory self-defense or not, this is what Lord Ashburton gave the analogy of. He said, supposing a man standing on ground where you have no legal right to follow him has a weapon long enough to reach you and is striking you down and endangering your life. How long are you bound to wait for the assistance of the authority, having the legal power to relieve you, or to bring the facts more immediately to home to the ease, if cannon are moving and setting up in a battery which can reach you and are actually destroying life and property by their fire, if you have remonstrated for some time without effect and see no prospect of relief, when begins your right to defend yourself, should you have no other means of doing so than by seizing your assailants on the verge of neutral territory? So at the time, this was not seen as anticipatory in any sense. This was seen as an ongoing attack that was occurring.
Yep.
The US was not doing anything about it. And so the argument of Canada and Britain was, well, we've got to. And if anything, in terms of modern international law, it's actually an example of necessity.
Right.
And that's what the International Law Commission has actually used it for. So this is the other funny thing about Caroline, is it's oft cited as anticipatory self-defense. This is the test for it. But when you look at who cites it, the International Court of Justice hasn't, the International Law Commission has, but as an example of necessity, not as an example of anticipatory self-defense. But it's become this thing that...
So 2 things maybe worth teasing out there. First, I can hear, but first before that, I can hear someone shouting in the background at me, kind of going, wait a minute, in a modern civil conflict with non-state insurgents, actually you probably couldn't target the Caroline unless it was being used at that exact moment for a military purpose, which is a separate issue, but let's hive that off. The other one being here, the distinction between justifications and excuses in international law, on which obviously Federica Perdue has written a lot. But the conflation here is that you plead necessity when you've done something unlawful, but didn't have time or capacity to do anything else. So it's an excuse. Whereas we think of self-defense as a right. It's, you justify action, you're justified in doing things that would otherwise be illegal. So there's a weird conflation here between concepts of justification and excuse. Am I wrong?
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And I think, and this goes to your first point too, I think the other thing that we have to remember when we talk about the Caroline is this all happened in 1837.
Right.
So the modern law on use of force and self-defense was not developed. So sort of using this case to say things about what states can do in 2025, I think is problematic, because
Yes.
what they talked about as justified is very different to what we would talk about.
Well, war was still a legitimate instrument of state policy just to begin with.
Exactly. And the prohibition on the use of force didn't exist. So the idea that this formula, which, as you say, conflates what we would now talk about as justification and excuses that occurred in the context of an ongoing conflict, the idea that that is something that we now use to talk about anticipatory self-defense, as I said, I think we need to just be careful when we do it.
Right. So it is at best a pretty shonky analogy. So why are we stuck with it? How has this come to have such a sort of totemic appeal in international law?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So as I said, it didn't actually make a big splash. Oh gosh, there's a nice pun, isn't there? It didn't it didn't cause a massive deal at the time. It was, as I said, part of these letters, but only part of them. But I think who we have to actually thank for it is Robert Jennings, a behemoth of international law, who wrote an article 101 years after the Caroline sank, in 1938, which got published in the American Journal of International Law. And it was when he was at the University of Cambridge. The start of the article reads, "There is probably no branch of international law which is so calculated to encourage the skeptic as that mass of contradictory precedents, dogmatic assertions, and vague principles which are collected under the common head of intervention. And perhaps there is no more potentially dangerous ground of intervention than that which is variously described as self-preservation and self-defense. It was in the Caroline case that self-defense was changed from a political excuse to a legal doctrine."
Interesting.
And then he says, the Caroline became the single most important reference of customary international law regarding the right to self-defense.
But how does it become a reference for customary international law? Okay, so I mean, just some context. Jennings, as you say, was a very eminent legal scholar at the University of Cambridge. He had a big influence on the British approach to international law. I think he held his chair at Cambridge into the early 80s. So, during my time as a PhD student in Cambridge, there were people there who had been taught by Jennings. And, he was referred to as Robbie Jennings, as if he'd only just left the room. So this is a relatively recent figure and someone who one would presume knows something about the sources of international law. But how does a diplomatic note between two people who don't necessarily, did they hold government office? But even so, how is that customary law generating unless it's cited by a whole lot of other government officials in other situations?
It's a good point. And I have to step back here because that second quote I read was actually someone writing about the Jennings article, not Jennings himself.
Oh, okay. Yep.
So my lack of clarity there. But so Jennings, though, didn't assert it was custom at that point because, as you say, how could it be? It's at most state practice of two states.
Right.
That's it. State practice, opinio juris, perhaps, yeah. But that's it. That's two states. Jennings just went through and essentially pulled out the correspondence, pulled out all the facts, and then used that quote. But even then he said, and this is Jennings writing, a formula that has become famous. So even then, that formula, that necessity of self-defense, instant and overwhelming, had traction, I guess. Although, as I said, not cited by cases or anything like that. And it's really then this article that I think formed the basis of relying on the Caroline. And we were chatting just before the show, and you said something, it's basically one well-written article placed at the right time can actually have a very big influence on the development of international law.
Right. Well, and particularly when it becomes used as the springboard for a discussion. So we had, Dina and I had this sort of conversation around the Lotus case. Why does it have this authority? Well, because there's a whole lot of chapters in textbooks, either on jurisdiction or general principles, which kind of hold up the Lotus case in order to disagree with it. And it just becomes, it's sort of become this formulaic way of the way one begins to discuss X is you start with the Lotus case.
Exactly right. And that's exactly what has come with the Carolyn. So there's an article that was written a few years ago that sets out various statespeople who refer to the Carolyns in speeches. And it's a shorthand in a way, I guess. But I think maybe because it's a well-written formula. But, you know, there's speeches by UK Attorney Generals, there's speeches by the Australian Attorney General. And so it's really common, even though it's not referred to in cases per se, it's really common that this is what you do when you talk about anticipatory self-defense. You say the doctrine of anticipatory self-defense as established in the Carolyn case allows this when it is necessity of self-defense, overwhelming, instantaneous, exactly, et cetera, et cetera.
There's also that body of papers that writers of Jennings' era were very fond of, the opinions of the law officers of the Crown. So I don't know if that crops up, but for those who aren't aware of it, the law officers of the Crown are essentially the British, what we'd now call the British Foreign Office legal advisors. And they used to write these long learned internal opinions on all sorts of things. And essentially, after what we would now call a declassification period, a lot of them were published. And then the kind of early positivists, particularly at Cambridge, were very, very fond of scraping around for any written materials they could and incorporating them into their textbooks. So I don't know, is there any trace in your research that the kind of people who are writing these things at the time sort of saw it also, not just in speeches, but in diplomatic correspondence? Or am I off on a frolic of my own here?
Well, I think a frolic of your own sounds delightful, but well, I don't know is the answer. But it is, however, it is, you know, it is all very much based on those letters between Ashburton and Webster. And I think there is something to say there is that, you know, they were written and they were kept and they are still, the text of them is still available. And so because of that,
when you don't have a lot of sources, anything will do.
Exactly. You know, international legal writing from 1842, which is when these letters were written, is not super thick on the ground, especially international legal writing that uses very clear language to say this is what we're talking about. This is a principle of international law that we're talking about.
I need a source for it, and this will do. So just as a sidebar, this reminds me of a joke I once saw from a quote-unquote modern historian, and it was a timeline. And the timeline had sort of, you know, the first chunk of it was just labeled before the 19th century, and under that was written not enough sources. Then there was a chunk marked the 19th century, and under that was written exactly the right quantity of written sources. And after that was, you know, the 20th and 21st century, under which was just written journalism.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So this occurred in the right amount of sources period, right? And this occurred when international law, you know, both the initial event, but then Jennings' article in 1938, when the international law project was really, really seriously taking off. So I think it was, you know, Jennings sort of reviving these letters and saying this is a really important statement about self-defense, happened at a time when people were, I guess, wanting to have some, you know, clarification and authority about what you could and could not do in self-defense. And so it's just...
And I mean, not much, in terms of that quest for sources, not much later than this sort of period or about this time, you've got Lauterpacht founding the international law reports. So the sense that to be an international lawyer is a distinct profession and you need materials with which to do it. And there was an interest in starting to collate these historic cases and incidents.
Exactly. And that's And that's exactly what Robert Jennings does. So again, I'm reading from his article here. And he says, at a time when the law has become once more fluid and is undergoing rapid change, a reconsideration of the Caroline controversy may serve a useful end.
The law is becoming more fluid and undergoing rapid change. Sounds
1938.
dreadfully familiar, doesn't it?
Doesn't it? Doesn't it just? Shout back to the episode that we recorded just recently on where is international law going?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not saying that Caroline isn't useful, but I am saying that first, it's not a case, but second, just I think a bit of context for what it was actually saying is needed when using it for anticipatory self-defense. Now, I guess the thing is, though, because international law is fluid and evolving, the fact that now so many states and their representatives do refer to this doctrine when talking about anticipatory self-defense means it has become part of the test.
Right.
Even if it wasn't properly speaking before. Exactly.
So, which is another interesting point about how international law works. We were talking before we started recording about the bootstrapping effect, that even if something has no historical foundation, if states say it often enough and act as if it is part of the law, it becomes part of the law no matter its origins, which is one of the things that I think is poorly understood when, I mean, I think international legal history is interesting and a genuinely worthwhile project, but doesn't really prove very much most of the time, because going backwards and proving that words used to mean something different, the most that ever does for you is to unsettle your assumptions about sort of the range of interpretive possibilities now. Like, you can't really say very often that there's an authentic meaning that hasn't changed across time, because what lawyers do is we pass concepts from generation to generation. They get worn smooth and repurposed.
Exactly. And so that's why in some ways I am being pedantic. You know, does it matter that it wasn't the case? Does it matter that it wasn't?
Wait, pedantry on a legal podcast? I'm shocked.
Does it matter that it wasn't actually anticipatory self-defense if it has been accepted as such? But as I said before, perhaps this acceptance as such isn't as widespread as you would think. You know, the fact that that really it was an example of necessity, and that's what the International Law Commission certainly uses it as, I think means there is a bit of room in terms of examining, wait, what do these words mean? Is it really about self-defense, or is it as a right, or is it a justification that you're talking about here?
And in any event, even accepting that formula, was it accepted between the parties at the time that the destruction of the Caroline was actually justified?
No. So the parties accepted that the formula was valid, but the ongoing controversy between them was that the British Lord Ashburton was saying it was justified under this formula, and the American Daniel Webster was saying it wasn't.
So again, classic legal dispute. We've agreed on the norm that governs the dispute. We haven't agreed on how it applies to these facts.
Exactly.
So, so again, to put it in a modern kind of context about the debate about what is the difference between ordinary self-defense and anticipatory self-defense, the example I always liked that Yoram Dinstein used to give was the incoming missile. So shooting down a missile in international airspace or over the high seas before it enters your territory, when it's plainly going to enter your territory, would appear to satisfy the Caroline formula, right? You can't negotiate with a missile. There's no time to wait. You have no other effective means. And it would be ridiculous to say you have to wait until the missile lands on a city to do anything about it. And he came up with a sort of third category, which maybe it's helpful, maybe it isn't, of interceptive self-defense, when the attack is launched but not yet landed. So that would clearly fit within the Caroline formula. But the question then is, how many steps before that can you go?
Exactly. So so the Caroline formula, you know, just going back to it, instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. Yeah, you've got to stop the missile. But yeah, as you said, the issue is that when some states talk about anticipatory self-defense, they're not talking about stopping a missile mid-flight.
No. Well, and so in terms of kind of the spectrum of self-defense possibilities, maybe we should just put this in context for any sort of non-specialist listener. So, I mean, it's as you've said, Imogen, very weird to cite a 19th century case, which isn't a case, as the governing law when it wasn't the governing law in an article in the 1930s. And okay, 1930s, rise of fascism, war on the horizon, quite a lot to think about. But then, as of 1945, 1946, we have the UN Charter, which completely changes the law of self-defense. Well, okay, so there's a debate about the extent to which it does, blah, blah, blah. But post 1945, we at least have this idea that under Article 51 of the UN Charter, you only have a right of self-defense if an armed attack has occurred and the Security Council is taking no action. So that's fairly straightforward. You've absorbed the first blow, now you have a right to self-defense. Then beyond that, we have preemptive self-defense. Well, surely it doesn't make sense that you actually have to take the first hit before you can act to defend yourself, and everyone would agree that with some margin there, that makes sense. Then we have in the early 2000s the so-called Bush doctrine of preemptive self-defense, the idea that sometimes you have to take action before the threat materializes. Not a very widely subscribed to view, and some question marks about how often actually the Bush administration clearly articulated that beyond, I think, one national security strategy. But then we can go sort of even further, or at least as far, with the because this whole original incident involved non-state actors, right?
Yes.
So everything I've just spoken about has been about self-defense against the action of a state.
Yes.
So do you want to link this to debates about self-defense against non-state actors and the so-called unable or unwilling doctrine? How does that come about, and how does that relate to what we're talking about?
Doug, I am so glad you asked that, because here is another quote from 1838, so just after the incident happened. This is from two other politicians at the time, and Sir George Arthur wrote, "The American authorities were either unable or unwilling to prevent aggression against Canada."
Boom!
Boom. Exactly.
Mic drop.
Yeah.
Right. So the first people to invoke unable or unwilling is not the Bush administration in 2001. It's some British lords dealing with attacks on the Canadian colonies by the Americans.
Exactly. Exactly. And so that's why the Carolyn case is fascinating, because actually a lot of these things that we're dealing with now that are really controversial, were brought up then. So the idea, unable or unwilling, the idea of that is that if something is happening in a state and that state is unable or unwilling to prevent it from happening, so we're talking about non-state actors who are either preparing to or have attacked another state, their home state is unable or unwilling to stop them, the doctrine says, well, the state that is either going to be under attack or has been attacked then has the right to go in and stop them.
Right.
And, this was a lot of the sort of justification, as you said, of the Bush administration for some of the acts they took. It's language that has appeared in Security Council resolutions. It's language that's used to justify various acts of, as you say, preemptive self-defense, not where you're anticipating an imminent attack, but you think an attack might be happening sometime in the future.
Or in the case of the events of September 11, 2001 and the subsequent conflict in Afghanistan, the idea at the time that this appalling act had occurred with hundreds of deaths in the United States, undoubtedly a sort of mass casualty event on any scale, acknowledged as having given rise to a right of self-defense in some form by the UN Security Council and by NATO allies invoking Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. Very different days. But then the question was, okay, but can you act against two things? One, can you act against a non-state actor present in another state's sovereign territory? Because arguably a use of force against their territory is going to be an act of aggression. But also, is the right of self-defense limited to repelling an attack that is ongoing? Can it encompass a situation where you've had, a devastating first strike attack? There is no obvious further attack coming, but you strongly believe that there may potentially be waves of further attacks. So again, Yoram Dinstein, I think, made the argument that, it's ridiculous to limit self-defense to ongoing attacks because it encourages blitz warfare or, single devastating nuclear strikes. Now, I'm not sure the extent to which I find that sort of fully convincing doctrinally, but it's certainly an argument. So where unable and unwilling comes together is you have this confluence of two things. One, you may have a single strike rather than an ongoing attack, or episodic strikes, right? The classic one in this situation is like the Caroline affair, cross-border raids. And the thing is, well, do we have to wait for the next cross-border raid? And then that question of what do you do about non-state actors present in another state's territory? So you've got this double element of temporality, does it need to be ongoing? And territoriality, where are these people? And the unable or unwilling doctrine was meant to resolve those issues.
Yeah, exactly. And the Caroline, really encapsulates that really neatly because, as the Caroline was not a military ship, the US citizens were not US military, they were non-state actors. There's no suggestion the US government was funding them or aiding them. All they were doing was not stopping them.
Right.
And this is, and I'll just go back to the quote I read earlier from Lord Ashburton. He says, when he's using the analogy of if a cannon was setting up, it was actually destroying life and property by their fire. If you have remonstrated for some time without effect and see no prospect of relief, when begins your right to defend yourself, should you have no other means of doing so than by seizing your assailant on the verge of a neutral territory? And so this was the US's point was you shouldn't have come to our territory. You have now breached our territorial integrity. And Britain's point was, well, we had to because you weren't stopping them and they were going to keep attacking us.
Well, and this question is still live in situations like Israel's incursion into Lebanon in pursuit of Hezbollah, right? Lebanon can say, well, Hezbollah is not an organ of state. Some would argue that it's a quasi-governmental entity in certain areas, or was. And Israel will say, why should we have to wait until you do something if you're not capable of doing it? While you might be neutral in relation to us, shouldn't we be able to enter your territory and prevent these things happening?
Yeah, exactly. And so it's an ongoing controversy. And I think, that sort of brings me back to, why do I care? Like, am I just being pedantic? And I was thinking about this, and I wrote, as you know, a book on general principles of law. And one of the reviews of that book said very nicely, essentially, this book is just a plea for precision. And I think that's actually the way I approach international law generally, is two things. And they're, in a way, a little bit contradictory, but I'm always asking for precision. Don't just cite something generally without knowing what you're citing. But the other half of it is I always want context. So I think this is why the Caroline irritates me, is there is a lack of precision in how it's cited, but there's also a lack of context in how it's cited. And actually, I think it's a lot more interesting if you have that precision and that context to talk about the affair.
Yep. No, all of that makes sense. And I suppose we should say before closing that obviously the unable or unwilling doctrine, as we hinted, remains enormously controversial and has never been really accepted as an authoritative statement of customary international law by the global South. And there's a tendency amongst certain English-speaking scholars to kind of count English-speaking countries plus Israel. And sort of by the time you get to, the US has said it, the UK has said it, Canada has said it, Australia has said it, Israel has said it, bingo, it's supported by the international community and is customary international law. So there we are. All right, so we normally wrap up with something fun, but I just want to ask in conclusion, is it just that question of precision and context that's about the Caroline case for you? Like why when we were thinking about, what are the cases that are our personal bugbears, why did this one stick?
I think that's what it is, really. I think it's probably because, marking undergraduate international law exams, the amount of times I've written, it's not a case in the margins, is probably one of them. Because, you can say, oh, what does it matter? What does it matter what it was? Well, it does matter, because you start thinking, hang on, if it was a case, what court in 1842 was deciding an international law case? What are you actually talking about here in the development of international law? And I think it's good to think critically about those things. And so just to give you another example, and this is like way left field, but why it's important, and probably more than anything nowadays, to think critically about things. A few weeks ago, Elon Musk said part of the whole USAID defunding and all the discussions about where US funding is going to go, there was this statement about how US funding is giving hundreds of thousands of dollars, I forget the exact figure, but a lot of money for condoms in Gaza. And this was just accepted. Like, we're wasting our money, we're sending condoms to Gaza. Wait a minute, like, you step back and you go, well, what? Why is the US, that doesn't sound right, that the US would be sending, lots of money on contraceptives for Gaza. No, they're not. It's a clinic in, I think it was Mozambique, that the town is called Gaza. And it's a health clinic that is, giving contraceptives to try and stop the transmission of HIV.
Right.
But no one stopped and thought critically, hey, this doesn't sound right that we're doing this. And then it gets picked up. And then actually Elon Musk did say, yeah, I was wrong, and apologized. But, that doesn't get picked up by the news cycle. No. What gets picked up is this, where it's a waste of money. Why are we doing this? We're just, So I do think that thinking critically about things that just don't sound right is a really important skill. And maybe it is right. And maybe you go, oh, I learned something that I didn't know. Or maybe you go, no, that doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound right that there was an international court in 1842 that was deciding international law matters. I don't think this is actually an international case. And
even looking at the date, you've then got to ask, wait a minute, didn't certain things that might have changed the law of self-defense, such as the UN Charter, arrive in the meantime?
Exactly. So I think that's it. It is that lack of precision, but I don't think it's just being pedantic. I think there is merit to just asking a few critical questions about things that sometimes seem a bit odd.
Well, I think we're entering an era where asking a few critical questions about things that seem odd is going to keep us very busy indeed. But I think you're right. It's one of the skills that anyone should get out of a university education, particularly in law. Imogen, that seems a good place to leave things. Do you have any last questions or comments before we wrap up?
Well, Doug, I do have to ask. I can see it, but please tell our viewers, what are you wearing? It's a very nice ensemble today.
Thank you very much. It's a bit warmer again in Canberra today, so I am wearing green linen trousers with a light blue linen shirt. My wife would probably say that's too much linen. Grey blue braces and a paisley cravat.
And can I say, I'm very impressed with the lack of wrinkles in your linen.
Well, thank you. Freshly ironed, only recently worn, and I'm sure the camera is doing us some good. But with that, thank you everyone very much for listening, and we'll be with you again soon.
Bye.